Hi, it's Michael Dermer, and in this lesson, we're going to be talking about how much money to raise and when. It's often very difficult to determine the amount of money you should bring in, and at what stage you should bring it in. So we're going to talk through those details. So how do you determine how much money you should bring into your company and when you should bring it in? Remember, the implications of this is that you're giving away part ownership of your company if you're doing an equity investment. And a lot of times at early stages, you're not going to be able to go get a loan to your company where you're going to actually make a commitment to pay it back. You're going to bring in equity in which someone's going to own a piece of your business. So it's a very deep and personal decision about how much money you're going to bring in and when you're going to bring that money in to maximize that balance between the capital you need and preserving ownership of your company. So let's get into some of those specifics, okay? Why do you determine a certain amount of money in a certain time? First is kind of the desire for ownership, right? So when you really think about it, let's say you own 100% of your company and you've just generated $100,000 of sales and you go out and you want to raise $1 million, you're probably going to give away a pretty sizable piece of your company. So one of the most important considerations early on is ownership. How much ownership do you want to retain of the company? The difficulty in dealing with this is the fact that if you have a big vision for what you're trying to do, you need money to realize that vision. And a lot of times you need that money to get it from point A to point B. So at the early stages, right, when you come to the table and you say, hey, I have this great vision, this idea I want to bring to life, you may not have a lot of revenue. You may not have a lot of traction. So you're often raising money at an early stage where when you do bring in money, that the amount of ownership that you may have to give away is significant. So that's a very delicate balance and much more art than science. Some folks say it's much better to raise a lot of money and to give away more ownership and do it more quickly. And others will say, well, build kind of blood, sweat, and tears, bootstrap it for a while till you get more traction so that you have more evidence, right? And you can then garner a bigger valuation and give away less ownership. Another critical factor that goes hand in hand with that is control. And what I mean by control is that, as soon as somebody owns over 50% of your company, they essentially have control of the company. Not complete control, but certainly control of the board of directors and some of the decision-making processes that happen. And so maintaining a level of control is largely dictated by, again, the valuation of your company and how much money you bring in. If you're going to raise $1 million and that $1 million is going to give someone 55% ownership of the company, they're essentially going to have control of the company. And so your desire for control at a certain stage will also dictate, right, how much money you raise and when. Let's say in my example, $1 million was going to get 55% of the company. You might say, hey, well, I don't want to give up that control, so I'm going to raise $500,000 in which they only get 22.5% of the company in my example. Okay, so control is also an important factor. Next is your investor. A lot of time investors will say, I only want to make minority investments, meaning that I don't want to own more than 50% of the company. Other investors will say, we only make investments in which we have a controlling interest or more than 50%. So it's not just your desire, it's the desire of the particular investor that you're talking to about how they think about making investments into different types of companies. Another key factor in the amount of money you raise and when is aligning the interests of investors with you and whatever team that you have. Good investors will want to get as much ownership as they can, but at the same time, they will want the founders, namely you and your team, to be heavily motivated. The last thing that an investor wants is a demotivated team because they don't own enough of the company. That being said, on the other hand, investors are trying to get as much ownership so if the company is successful, right, they can realize the returns that they want. And so the balance that has to be struck is, what is the right amount of money that gives investors the ownership piece that they want so they can get returns, and at the same time gives you and your team enough going forward that you're you're incentivized to grow the business to everybody's benefit and having those interests aligned. Another factor that goes into how much money to raise and when is your readiness, right? A lot of times at early stages, before you've been able to bring in the right people, before you have all the right systems and processes you need, which is often the case with early stage businesses, you're not ready to take on $10 million. You might be much more likely to take on $250,000. You might be able to hire an experienced CFO, or you might be able to hire some folks that can help you get to the next stage of your company. So then you're much more well prepared to take in bigger dollars into the company. So kind of your own readiness is also a factor that goes into how much money to raise and when. So, those are some of the kind of general considerations. Obviously, valuation and ownership is probably the most critical one because that impacts, your business going forward and who owns what. But here are a couple of guardrails to help you when you talk about trying to figure out the amount of money to raise, right? First is, what amount of money do you need to achieve key milestones? So let's say, for example, it's the first launch of your technology product, right? Or it's the hiring of 2 key team members, right? Or it's the achievement of a certain level of sales. You would choose your investment amount about what it would take to achieve those key milestones. Now, I know it's never linear in the sense as it's just hiring somebody or just sales or just technology. A lot of times those things have to happen at the same time. But think about the minimum amount of money you need to achieve those key milestones. And then if you're bringing that money and you achieve that milestone, then you're in a better position to raise more money in the future going forward, okay? On top of achieving key milestones, you should add yourself a buffer, right? Because early stage businesses always have flux, right? Things don't work out the way you want them to. They cost more, people leave, things change. So a good rule of thumb is to take the amount of money it requires to achieve those key milestones we just mentioned and add what you need for 6 more months to operate, right? So that gives you just an additional buffer to think about, okay, I've got to achieve this milestone, but if I'm a little bit off, I don't have to worry about the fact that I'm going to run out of cash, okay? And then in addition to milestones plus your 6 months, you might consider an additional buffer, okay? You want to have a little bit of extra dollars, in the coffer to be able to address different changes that come up along the way. So when you take these different factors into account when you're thinking about raising money, how do you go about communicating that to investors, okay? First of all is, don't communicate a range of money. Communicate an actual dollar value. And why is that? What investors want to know is that you have a plan, right? And that plan says that we're going to achieve these milestones, we're going to put in money for an additional 6 months, and we're going to have a little bit of a buffer, and we have decided that that is $2 million, okay? When you come to the table and you give them a range, it gives the sense that you don't really have a plan, right? And it's much better to put your best foot forward with the plan that you've laid out and align your dollars specifically to that plan. So these are some of the factors that you use to determine how much to raise, and you can see it's a lot more art than science, but also, what about the timing? What is the best timing for you to go out and raise money? And it all relates to milestones. We've talked a lot, in this lesson, in this course, about the achievement of milestones and how important that is. So here are 2 of the best times to actually raise money. One is right before you're about to achieve a milestone. So let's say that you've made some progress, right? And you're a little bit away from achieving a milestone. It's great to be able to go to an investor and say, you're about to put money into an engine that's really humming, right? So you're just about to achieve a major milestone. Second is right after you've achieved a major milestone. Let's say you've hired key employees. Let's say you've just won a couple of customers. A great time to go to investors is right after you've achieved that milestone. So as you can probably tell, a lot relates to the achievement of milestones. That is a demonstration that you're moving forward and you're making progress. And so raising money immediately before or just after milestones can really bolster the valuation of your business. As you can see, determining how much money to raise and when has got a lot of different factors associated with it. We've gone through a bunch here, but we've also laid out some pretty detailed information in this lesson side by side with this video.